Number 1. When I was about 13, I lived in a small town in Arkansas. The population was only about 2,500 people, so you knew nearly everyone you lived around. In February of 1997, I was hanging out with a friend who wanted to go over to a girl's house that he had a crush on. When we arrived at her house, she suggested that we go and visit another friend of ours. Apparently, her mum and her mum's boyfriend were out, and we could go over and chill with just her and her mum's boyfriend's brother. It was only a couple of blocks away, so it took us little time to make it to their house. At the door, we met her mum's boyfriend's brother, and from my first impression, he just seemed like an okay guy. A bit off, but he seemed harmless. We didn't recognize him at the time, and we knew him and his brother were new to town, so we tried not to judge. We were all around 13 or 14 years old, and it was cool to get to hang out with an adult who let us smoke cigarettes and cuss openly. He just seemed to enjoy the attention he got, being the cool adult. From there, it took a couple of weird turns. He started flirting with our friend, who was obviously a minor. She jokingly said she was going to slap him, to which he said, "Go ahead." With one motion, she reared back and slapped him across the face as hard as she could, leaving a bright red mark across his face. He pulled his head back and started to let out a laugh, a big laugh, and then he invited her to do it again. She paused a moment and then slapped him again, and again he continued to laugh. She stopped after slapping him the 4th or 5th time, mostly because her hand was hurting. At this point, his face was bright red, but he just kept laughing even after she had stopped. A few minutes later, we all went into the living room, and my buddy and I took a seat on the sofa. In hindsight, this is one of the creepiest experiences of my life. My friend was inspecting the compartment located under the central armrest of the couch when he noticed a handgun located within. Excited, my friend pulled it out and started looking at it. That's when the man took notice. He quickly walked across the room and took it away from my friend. He stood there for a second, looking at both of us. Then he smiled, removed the clip, and made sure the chamber was empty before handing it back to me. He then said, "I just want to make sure neither of you hurt anyone with that thing." We both took turns inspecting it, and then returned it to him. It was a very odd evening, but I grew up around a sketchy environment as is, so it was by far not the worst thing I'd ever been around. However, the following week, I was walking to school when I stopped at the local gas station where I usually bought a soda. On my way out of the station, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the man we had just spent an evening with the previous weekend on the front page of the local paper. Not just him though, his brother as well. We would find out later that day that both of them had murdered a 71-year-old truck driver just a few miles away in another town just a couple of weeks prior to meeting us. They had also kidnapped and raped 2 young women and slit their mother's throat just a couple of days after we met them. The mother was strong-willed enough to drag herself to a neighbor's house and call the police. I never at any point felt under threat, but I often think about what would have happened to my friends if maybe it could have been them raped and brutalized instead of those poor women just about 30 minutes away from where we met that man. In the description below is an article about the brothers. Their names are Alan and Richard. The submitter of this particular story met Richard. Number 2. This happened when I was 10. I lived in a relatively suburban neighborhood, but my house was in the very back corner of the neighborhood, with several acres of trees behind it. Nearby, there was a large hill, which all the kids in the neighborhood would go sledding down during the winter months. One day, after it had recently snowed, I walked the quarter of the mile to the hill, but the only person there that day was a young man. He wasn't sledding. He was just sitting at the top, looking down over the street, which seemed odd, but nothing really bothered me about him. Being the friendly child that I was, I walked up and greeted him. "Hi, good snow today, hey?" He was wearing shades and a hat, and when I talked to him, I was immediately very unsettled. His face remained bored. "Yes, very. What's your name?" While I was normally fine telling people my name, I was very put off by this guy and chose to lie. Ryan," I said, before sledding down the hill. After a few more times of walking back up the hill and sledding back down, I noticed that the man was watching me. Finally, after my 5th or 6th time climbing up the hill, he asked, "Where do you go to school?" Completely out of the blue. I was continuing to get very bad feelings talking to this guy, so again I lied. But it was very obvious that I was lying. I was stuttering over my words and I changed my answer mid-sentence. "Oh, I go to a private school." He said, "I don't think you go there. Where do you really go?" At that point, I wanted to leave as quickly as possible. I said, "I'm sorry, I have to go." I zipped down the hill and ran along the street. He watched me the entire time I ran off. The whole experience was really unnerving, but I was worried that if I told my mum about it, she wouldn't let me go to the hill by myself anymore. So I chose not to mention it. A few weeks later, my parents had to run to the store to grab something. I was playing a computer game, and I asked to stay home. My parents obliged, since they were only going to be gone for an hour or so. They made sure to lock the front door and the back door before leaving. About 30 minutes later, I heard someone trying to turn the doorknob, which was odd, since I hadn't heard anyone knocking, and my parents would have only just gotten to the store. But when I went to check, there was nobody there. So I figured I was hearing things and returned to my game. Now, my house had a sunroom off the side, which my mother would paint in. The sunroom led into the room that we used as the computer room. It had an outside door with a normal lock, and there was a hotel-style sliding bar lock on the interior door into the house. About 5 minutes later, I had returned to my computer, 10 feet from the door. Suddenly, it slammed open 2 inches before catching the bar on the lock. At this point, I screamed, and I ran to wake up our German Shepherd who was sleeping upstairs. When I ran back downstairs with him, I saw one of my mother's palette knives being jammed between the door and the wall, trying to pry open the sliding lock. My dog went ballistic and started barking furiously and slammed itself into the door. He was a huge dog with a terrifyingly loud bark, and I heard the man drop the knife and slam the exterior door as he ran out of the house. A moment later, I saw someone outside get into a car and speed off. It was too dark to see who it was. I cried and locked myself upstairs with my dog until my parents were home. I told them everything through my tears. We checked the sunroom, and the exterior door had been left unlocked when they left. They called the police, who were, unfortunately, unable to get any evidence from our house. The palette knife was mangled and bent, and the bar lock had scrapes and cuts all over it. I refused to be home alone again until I was 17. I never saw the man from the hill again, and to this day, I don't know if it was the same man who tried to break into my house, but the fact that he didn't leave when I screamed meant that he either didn't care that I was in the house, or he was there because I was there, alone. To this day, I don't know what would have happened to me if my dog hadn't been there, or if the door to my computer room hadn't been locked. But it scares me to think about it. Number 3. This happened to my best friend, who we'll call Sarah, while in her last year of college. She'd gotten bored of dorm life, and eventually she found a huge house off of campus with 3 roommates, 2 girls and 1 guy. They were all college students at the same university. She'd had diabetes for most of her life, and as such, she had to use insulin pretty much on a daily basis. Needles are an annoying yet necessary part of her daily life. During her last semester, the male roommate, who we'll call David, had been hiding an addiction for a long time, as well as the fact that he was failing college. He'd started using needles to shoot up. Sarah was the one who noticed. She was clued in by the small things at first. Her bedroom door being closed or open when she'd left it the other way. Missing jewelry, a missing iPod, and missing cash. But the strangest thing by far was that she was running out of her insulin syringes at a faster rate than she should have been. At this point, she still had no idea about David's problems, but she just attributed the missing items to misplacing them, or possibly someone lifting something during a party. But the needles, she couldn't figure that one out. That was until one day, when one of her professors didn't show up for a class, and she got to go home early. When she got inside, David was playing music loud as fuck, and when she went to ask him to turn it down, he didn't answer his door and it was locked. Since she wasn't getting a response, she figured that he wasn't there or that something was wrong. So, she used a bobby pin to open his door. She found him, passed out on his bed, with a needle in his arm and a belt still wrapped around his bicep. She couldn't wake him up, so she called 911. Paramedics came. He was taken to hospital and released a few days later. This violated his part of the roommate agreement that they all shared, and as such, they all agreed to kick him out. He convinced them to let him stay for 2 more weeks, just to find a new place and get his shit together. He seemed apologetic and ashamed about it all, and Sarah felt horrible about the whole thing. She went as far as to help him find a rehab, and was such a good friend towards him. He seemed to really appreciate her help. She told me that looking back on it, he was a damn good actor. Then, one day, after he left, she went to give herself her insulin shot. She noticed that something was strange. On brand new syringes, the plunger is always pulled back a bit, so you push that tiny bit of air out, and then you pull the insulin into the reservoir. There was no air in this syringe. She got another one out, and the same deal. But when she got the third one out, she noticed there was a red dot of blood on the tip of it. In fact, every single one of them in her open bag of syringes had blood on the very end. Needless to say, she was horrified. She received a text message the next day from a concerned friend of David's who managed to get her number out of his phone. The text read as follows: "This is not a joke. Please do not tell David I told you about this. He fucking scares the shit out of me. Do not use your needles. And if you already have, please go to a doctor immediately. I can't live with myself if I don't warn you. He has hepatitis C, and he said he is going to teach you a lesson you will never forget. It turns out that David blamed her for his addiction being discovered. This insane fuck had decided that Sarah had ruined his life, and he was going to make her regret it for the rest of hers by giving her an incurable blood disease. I shudder to think about how this could have ended had she been less observant, or if he had not tried tricking her, but had instead gone and just stabbed her with one. It doesn't bear thinking about. Hi guys, Lazy here, and thank you so much for watching the video. Or listening to, I should say, shouldn't I? Either way, I hope you enjoyed this subscribers special. And if you're not already subscribed, then what the hell's wrong with you? This is the place to be, man. Join the Lazy Legion and you won't miss out on any more spooky tales. Man, I'm sounding desperate trying to make people subscribe. Anyway, as always, make sure to check out Anthony's artwork via the links in the description below. And I'll be back with another video in no time at all. Until then, guys, stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.